What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today, bringing you guys 5 sneaky risers and fallers from the NFL draft. I'm coming at you guys today with 5 players, 3 risers, 2 fallers from this NFL draft cycle and this 2021 offseason. These are not obvious names. I'm sure you guys know that James Robinson's a faller by now. These are a few deeper guys that when you dig deeper, you can really get into the fact that some of these guys took a big hit or a big jump due to this offseason, this NFL draft cycle. So I want to remind you guys, stay tuned for a special announcement today on YouTube and on Twitter. If you're not already following me on there, you can go check that out. It's on the screen right now. Like, comment, subscribe on this video if you guys are new. Let's hit the intro. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's going to be 3 risers, 2 fallers on this list. The first up on the docket is the first riser, Damien Harris, running back for the New England Patriots, currently the running back 35, about pick 105 or a late 8th rounder in Dynasty startups right now. I would say when you look at Damien Harris' situation, he was a fantasy hopeful last season. He had a down rookie season, didn't play that much, and we had lingering concerns with Sony Michel going into the season. So Damien Harris was a guy that a lot of people were grabbing at the end of their drafts, as a dart throw, upside sleeper type. One of the most ambiguous backfields probably in fantasy football history with the New England Patriots. This offense wants a featured runner. They drafted Sony Michel in the first round in 2018 to be that guy, and that has not worked out. He's been consistently injured and inconsistent when he's been on the field. Once Damien Harris last year got the opportunity, we saw him actually carve out a decent role for himself. Weeks 7 to 14, he had double-digit carries every single game. You could see starting against San Francisco in week 7, he had a 44% snap share, 10 carries, and then he had a target, 8 fantasy points. And then you could see consistently through week 14, he was a guy that was scoring, double-digit fantasy points about 50, 60% of the time. And right as he was establishing himself as a feature ball carrier, an above 50% snap share player, weeks 12 and 13 against Arizona and Los Angeles, he suffered a back injury and a blowout loss against the Rams in week 14, which is why he only played 42% of the snaps and only carried the ball 11 times. Had he finished the season throughout, I think we could have been talking about one of the more hot names in fantasy circles, a guy that a lot of people would peg as a breakout candidate this year. But because of that sour taste that he left in people's mouths, the fact that he left week 14's game early and the fact that he didn't finish out the season, everybody's just forgetting about this guy. Everybody's writing him off. They don't want anything to do with him. And I'm not saying this guy's a perfect player. He has limitations. He never ran more than 8 routes in a single game in 2020, and he never saw more than 2 targets in a game. So this is not a guy that has high-end RB1 upside. This is not a guy that can finish as the RB1 in fantasy. But what you are getting in Damien Harris is you're getting a great runner of the football. And I tweeted this out a couple days ago, but Damien Harris was PFF's number 2 graded running back over that, that stretch that he played and over the course of the season. He also ranked number 6 in true yards per carry, number 8 in juke rate, and number 9 in yards created per touch. So we're talking about a guy that was a good ball carrier and was able to make people miss. And that's really all you can ask for when you're a 2-down running back, which Damien Harris is likely to be. And this was despite, he was able to put up these efficiency numbers, despite seeing the number 1 amount of average defenders in the box at 7.4 and the second highest stacked front carry rate at 42%. So this is a guy that, despite having a situation, anytime he was on the field, defenses knew they were running the ball, and yet he was still effective, which is very impressive. And if that changes at all, right, if the Patriots quarterback play gets any better, if their pass catching core, which was just absolutely brutal and atrocious last year, gets any better, which it should be with the 2 tight ends, Aguilar and some of the other additions that they made, we could be looking at a situation where Harris is able to be a lot more efficient from a yards per carry perspective and all that stuff. But he was already efficient last year. So that just proves he is a good runner of the football. And when you look at his volume, he only had 137 carries in 10 games, which on the season is a pace of 219 carries. And Rex Burkhead is now gone. Sony Michel honestly might even be cut after the drafting of Ramondre Stevenson. And Ramondre Stevenson is the only addition that they made to this backfield. And he was a 4th-round running back that honestly didn't have a lot of production in college and is still a complete upside swing to even make the roster, in my opinion. Damien Harris remains one of the most overlooked winners of the NFL draft. And I think he's a solid bet for RB2 production in 2021. And when you look back at last year, 13 running backs had 225 plus touches and at least 8 touchdowns. None of them finished outside the top 15 running backs, and none of them finished outside the top 22 running backs in points per game. Like I said, and you can see on the screen there, this is a Damien Harris tweet disguised as a Mike Davis tweet, disguised as a Myles Gaskin tweet. Many Patriots beat reporters have come out and said that Harris is the feature ball carrier. And if he can continue his ascension as a player, he can take advantage of that featured role. And they could have added pieces in the offseason. They could have added Leonard Fournette and Chris Carson in free agency, which they were apparently looking towards, or a higher drafted player like a Trey Sermon or something of that nature. But all they added to this backfield, as I mentioned, was a 4th-round rookie with very limited experience carrying the ball, even in college, let alone in the NFL, and Ramondre Stevenson. So we know in this backfield, there's always roles, right? Bill Belichick and Josh McDaniels have roles in mind for their running backs. Stevenson and Michel should be competing for that Rex Burkhead role that we saw last year, and James White will have his normal role. That leaves Harris to serve in what used to be Sony Michel's role, but will now be about a 50 to 60% snap share running back between 200 and 240 carries on the season, maybe 20 to 30 targets at most, though, and primary value as a touchdown scorer. It's not an overly sexy fantasy pick. It's not a guy that is going to win you a league necessarily, but this is a guy with legitimate top 15 upside and a comfortable top 25 floor that you're going to be getting in the 8th, 9th round of Dynasty startup drafts. And this guy's only 24, 25 years old. And in redraft leagues, this is a guy that's going in about the 8th round of redraft leagues as well. So this is a guy that if he's your flex, if he's your RB3, whatever the case is, he's a guy that can comfortably slot into your lineup if you need him to, and flex him on a weekly basis, knowing that he's going to get good volume and a good chance at a touchdown every single week. So with that being said, let's go on to the next guy, the first faller on this list, and that's Logan Thomas, who's currently being drafted in Dynasty startup leagues, according to DLF, at tight end 14, 123rd overall as a 10th rounder. Now, for starters, for those of you guys that don't know, Logan Thomas was actually a quarterback coming out of school. He was a quarterback at Virginia Tech, I believe, who converted to tight end. And if your league mates who you're in a dynasty league, let's say they don't pay, too much close attention to a guy like Logan Thomas, if they think this guy's a young player who emerged, that's not the case. Thomas is 30 years old, coming off of a season where really volume was the culprit for his ability to finish as tight end 6 and tight end 7 in points per game. Thomas was 3rd in the NFL in targets last year amongst the tight end position with 110. I've mentioned on numerous occasions that 100 targets almost locks a tight end in for a top 6 to 8 finish at minimum, just due to the lack of involvement that the position sees in general. While volume is one of the most fundamental concepts in fantasy, in my opinion, it is the most difficult to predict year over year. And recency bias plays a big perception in the part of players who receive a lot of volume. Thomas closed out the season strong. He came out and, closed out the season with like 8, 9, 7, 6, 5 target games. And that volume will be very tough to repeat for Thomas. And the reason is because Logan Thomas last year was 3rd in dominator rating among tight ends. So a percentage of his team's receiving production, receiving touchdowns, receiving yards, was 3rd among tight ends, only behind Darren Waller and Travis Kelce. And that will be tough to accomplish without being an efficient player, which Logan Thomas was not last year. He had number 26 in fantasy points per route run and number 24 in fantasy points per target. The Washington football team has made a number of additions that could honestly be sliced a number of ways for Logan Thomas, but in my opinion, they're all going to negatively affect him. So for starters, we have Ryan Fitzpatrick coming in as the quarterback, which is going to be good for Thomas's efficiency due to Ryan Fitzpatrick, shout out Fitzmagic, being an upgrade over Alex Smith, Dwayne Haskins, and whoever else they were rolling out last year, Taylor Heineke or whatever. But however, the signing of Curtis Samuel, they signed him to a pretty big contract. The drafting of De'Ami Brown in the 3rd round, who I'm a big believer in, was my wide receiver 6 pre-NFL draft. And the return from injury from Kelvin Harmon, who was a guy that was being talked up throughout Washington's training camp cycle, are sure to dent the 27.6% receiving yards and touchdowns dominator rating that Logan Thomas had. So in addition to these players, Thomas will also have to still compete with Terry McLaurin and the 2 running backs for targets as well. Not to mention, the Washington football team threw the ball 601 times last year, which was top 10 in the NFL. And even with Fitzmagic coming in, right? This is a guy that's, he's a D gaffer. He likes to sling it downfield. That's going to be hard to repeat. 600 pass attempts is a lot from a volume perspective. And we know how good this Washington football team defense is, right? I don't think they're going to need to pass the ball at that high of a rate. I think that was more as a result of being inefficient on offense and having to continue to force things. But This team should be able to run the ball, play good defense. Their defense got even better. They added William Jackson in the secondary, drafted a linebacker in the first round. This should be a top 5 defense in the NFL. I don't think there's any way that they pass the ball 600 times this season. And Thomas isn't a guy I'm looking to get rid of necessarily. Let's say you have him in a dynasty league already, but his value dipped in my opinion, knowing that his draw and his appeal last year was volume and not efficiency. He's got an uphill battle to repeat as a top 8, top 6 tight end again this year. So he's a guy that I'm designating a faller. He's still a guy that I think is a decent option. He's going at tight end 13, tight end 14 in dynasty drafts. So if you need a win now tight end, I don't hate it, but just temper your expectations from what you saw last year, because I don't think we're going to expect the same thing to happen yet again. And he's a guy that you might be able to sell high, knowing that some people might expect that from him again, especially with Fitzmagic coming in, knowing that he's going to make that offense a bit better. So the next guy that we're going to get into is another riser, and that's going to be Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs currently going off the board as the RB21, 59th pick overall, so a late 4th round dynasty startup pick. Now, his startup ADP is about, it's about where it should be. But here's the thing with Josh Jacobs. If you're already in a dynasty league, meaning the startup has already happened, last year, 2, 3, 4 years ago, the perceived value of Josh Jacobs, if you gauge the public, if you gauge your league mates and the dynasty community, people want absolutely nothing to do with this guy. I know what you must be thinking. How can Josh Jacobs be a riser on your list when they signed Kenyon Drake in the offseason and when they lost their entire offensive line, basically? Here's why. The perceived value, as I mentioned, is absolutely rock bottom right now. If we look at this situation objectively, the Las Vegas Raiders last year ran the ball 457 times and had 112 running back targets. So that's 569 running back opportunities available in this backfield. Josh Jacobs has had an opportunity share of 67% last year and 64% in 2019. If his share drops even to 55%, which I don't expect to happen, I think he's going to be around the 60 to 65% range again. But let's say it drops to 55%. Then Kenyon Drake has a bit bigger of a role than I'm anticipating. 320 opportunities is what he'd be set to receive with that kind of volume, going back to what they had last year in terms of running back carries and attempts. So if anything, the rushing attempts might even go up, because this was a defense that ranked number 30 in the NFL last year in points against. So they ran the ball at a top 15 rate despite having a terrible defense and losing games. So if the defense gets any better, let's say it's a 22nd defense in the league, we could even see this number go up in terms of rushing attempts and rushing volume. So we're still talking about a running back who is going to receive an absolute monopoly on red zone work. No one really in the NFL sees a bigger monopoly on their team's red zone work that's not a feature workhorse like Christian McCaffrey than Josh Jacobs. Josh Jacobs ranked number 2 in the NFL in red zone touches last year with 65 opportunities, and number 3 in the NFL in goal line opportunities with 16. And Kenyon Drake, while he's a bigger threat to red zone carries and red zone opportunities than a guy like Jalen Richard or Devontae Booker was, he's still more of a pass-catching back. He's not a goal line back, and we saw that in Arizona. He struggled mightily to carry a feature workload. So is Drake concerning for Josh Jacobs? I mean, a little bit. I think he's a little concerning, but Devontae Booker vacates 93 rushing attempts and 21 targets, and I expect Kenyon Drake to eat into basically what Jalen Richard's role has been over the past couple of years as well. And I think Kenyon Drake can carve out a 150 to 180 opportunity role, similar to what Drake has honestly been his entire career. And if he only carves out 150 opportunities, as I mentioned, 569 for this entire backfield, 150 opportunities out of that 569 would still leave over 400 for Josh Jacobs. So a lot of people are going to overestimate the addition of Kenyon Drake. They're going to think it's a death sentence for Josh Jacobs, especially in redraft leagues where we're looking at a 1-year sample size. But the other concern, as I just mentioned previously, with Josh Jacobs is his offensive line, right? The Raiders essentially shipped out their entire offensive line, that top 5 unit that we know it was in 2019, with Colton Miller being the only stalwart left on that offensive line, and Richie Incognito, who they extended, Colton Miller, that is. But they cut Gabe Jackson, right? He was a starter on that offensive line in 2019. They traded Rodney Hudson to the Cardinals, and they traded Trent Brown back to the Patriots. Why I'm less concerned with this unit than what it looks like at face value, right? At face value, it looks like they lost 2 of their 4 best offensive linemen that they have and a pretty solid starter in Gabe Jackson. But why I'm less concerned is because the Raiders were not a top 5 unit like they were in 2019 last year. They were the 26th best run blocking line in the NFL per PFF, and they ranked 20th across the board in Football Outsiders DVOA. They were like 18th in adjusted line yards, 23rd in, rushing plays that were stuffed and stuff like that. So about 20th across the board. Before I get into this, I'm going to play right now an interview that Mike Mayock did on the Rich Eisen show, so you can hear the GM's perspective first, talking about what his offensive line situation was. And he was asked specifically by Rich Eisen, why did you trade your whole offensive line away, basically?
Why did you do that, Mike? That's a lot of people are wondering, why did you do that? I mean, you had veteran savvy. I mean, you just used two adjectives you'd normally want to ascribe to your line. Why did you do that with the line?
I have all the respect in the world for those two guys. Both of them were getting into their 30s now. They both made plus or minus $10 million a year. Trent Brown was in the $14 million area. So between the three of them, there was about $34 million of salary we offloaded. And while we did that, we think we got younger and more athletic. And that's with all due respect to Rodney and Gabe. But we draft a first-round right tackle. We think John Simpson, our left guard from last year, who we took in the fourth round, has a chance to be really good. We still have Denzel Good. We still have Richie Incognito. We re-signed our left tackle, Colt Miller, to a big contract, and we think Andre James has a chance to be a really good center. So, there comes a time. We got Andre as an undrafted free agent 3 years ago, and we think he's going to be very good. And so he's less expensive, he's younger, he's more athletic, and we're excited about the changes to our offensive line.
So now that you've heard the GM's perspective, here's my perspective on it. Let's take this piece by piece, right? So let's start with Trent Brown. Trent Brown played 5 absolutely injury-riddled games last year. He was not healthy, and the Raiders brought in an offensive tackle in the first round to replace him in Alex Leatherwood. He may have been a reach at the time. Like, I thought that pick was a reach. I didn't think he should have gone at 17th overall. But in 2018, the Raiders reached on Colt Miller. He shouldn't have gone as high as he did, and that worked out, I would say. Colt Miller signing a second contract is definitely a good sign of a guy that worked out to his draft capital. Plus, Alex Leatherwood has plenty of starting experience, which should help stabilize that right tackle spot quickly. And it can't be any worse than what he had last year, with Trent Brown playing only 5 games, completely banged up. And Sam Young, who played most of the season, he played about 10 games after that, recorded the 68th grade amongst offensive tackles, which was like bottom 20 in the NFL for offensive tackles that reach a certain snap threshold. So the right tackle spot, in my opinion, is an upgrade over it was last year. So now let's get to Gabe Jackson. Gabe Jackson played basically all the games last year. He played at a league average level ranking, according to PFF, 40th out of 77 qualified guards. And in my opinion, he's going to be replaced by Richie Incognito, who played 1 game last year, 1 full game, and was the Raiders' best run blocker back in 2019 when they had such a great line. Coincidentally, that 1 full game that Richie Incognito played was the game that Jacobs absolutely snapped against Carolina for 150 total yards and 3 touchdowns back in week 1. And had me considering Josh Jacobs as a potential league winner at that point. I thought after seeing that game, I'm like, holy shit, Josh Jacobs got 6 targets and 25 carries. This guy might legitimately be a workhorse feature bell cow. And then it kind of all went downhill as the whole offensive line started to get banged up. But lastly, here's the last one, that the loss that they had. And this one does hurt a lot more. And Rodney Hudson, who's been a stalwart on this offensive line for years now, was traded to the Cardinals. But as Mike Mayock described in that interview, he thinks that they have a younger option in Andre James. And from a dynasty perspective, that's good news for Jacobs, because Rodney Hudson is like 31, 32 years old. He was starting to decline. He's usually ranked amongst the best centers in the league, according to PFF. I think he ranked like 8th or 9th last year. So he was on a bit of the decline, but nonetheless, this was a long-winded way of saying that I think the Raiders can be at least as good as they were last year, which if not even better going forward into the future. And that just starts, honestly, with the offensive line being healthier than it was last year, because it was completely in shambles. The whole offense really was in shambles, with Ruggs dealing with injuries, with really only Darren Waller on offense to carry the load, and Nelson Aguilar to contribute as well. Jacobs is at a point in the eyes of the public that he can be acquired for pennies on the dollar. Like I said, in dynasty startups, he's probably going at about normal value, but I have to imagine in some leagues, he's going to slip. He's going to slip beyond that RB21 range that he's going right now. And if you're in a league that's already been drafted, I'm guessing the Josh Jacobs owner is a lot more concerned than they should be. And you should be able to acquire this guy for, honestly, you might even be able to trade a 2022 first for this guy. And this is the guy who just 2 years ago, he broke the record for PFF elusive rating. And just last year, in a down season, quote unquote, still ranked top 5 in evaded tackles and top 5 in yards created last year. and is still 23 years old. He's my age. He's 2 more years and a 5th-year option where he should be a feature ball carrier. And I have I have no concerns about his workload on the ground for the next 2 to 3 years, which is something I can't say about a lot of these other running backs like a Miles Sanders. So that volume stat that I talked about for Damien Harris, where I was like, 220 plus touches and 8 touchdowns, that's a lock for Jacobs. Like, Jacobs will get that volume. And like I said, all of the running backs that did that last year finished top 15, and all of them were in the top 22 of points per game. So if that happens for Jacobs, then we know exactly what we're getting out of this guy. He's, again, probably not going to finish as a top 5 running back, but a back-end RB1 is definitely the type of, ceiling that I expect for Jacobs. All right, on to the next guy. Our final faller of the list, we have Ryan Tannehill, quarterback for the Tennessee Titans, currently being picked in Dynasty startups at quarterback 13, the 28th overall pick, and an early 3rd rounder. So this is super flex format, so he's going to go higher, but this is an early pick we're talking about. And I would say of the guys on this list, I talked about sneaky risers and fallers. This is probably the most obvious of the guys on this list because we kind of already know what happened, but I just selected this guy at the 411 of our listener league startup, so about a round and a half below his actual ADP. But I needed to talk about this guy because I think a lot of people are going to underestimate the type of things that have happened to the Titans offense, and this is something I'm very concerned about. So I'm sure everybody knows the obvious reason why this guy would be a faller, right? The Titans lost a lot of offensive pieces this offseason. They lost Corey Davis. They lost Jonnu Smith. They even lost Khalif Raymond and Adam Humphries. They all left in free agency, leaving A.J. Brown as the sole weapon for Tannehill to throw to. And A.J. Brown's a freaking superstar. So we know that's going to be pretty adequate for at least the time being. But as phenomenal as A.J. Brown is, and I've used this expression before, but when you're not an elite quarterback, right? You're not Patrick Mahomes. You're not Russell Wilson. You're not Aaron Rodgers. You're not Deshaun Watson. You are only as good for fantasy as the weapons around you. And now, based on the way that Tannehill has played, you could argue that he might have played as well as some of those guys. But nonetheless, losing this kind of offensive skill talent for a guy that has only recently just emerged from relative quarterback obscurity in previous years has to make you concerned a little bit. I think Tannehill is a better quarterback now than what we saw from Tannehill in Miami. Obviously, he's definitely a better quarterback than what we saw in Miami. But I expect Tannehill to take a step back knowing that he finished top 7 at the position last year. I don't expect him to finish that high again. And here's my other big concern with Ryan Tannehill. And we'll get into this more next week when we talk about coaching changes. I'm going to do an AFC coaching changes video. Danny's going to do an NFC coaching changes video. But Arthur Smith is now gone from Tennessee. And we saw back in 2017 when Matt Ryan and the Atlanta Falcons, when you lose an innovative offensive coordinator, they lost Kyle Shanahan, Arthur Smith leaving in Tennessee. It can have a big time effect on your offense. It can make your offense regress from, one of the best units in the league to a league average type of unit. And when you look at the Titans offense over the past 2 years, they've definitely been one of the best offenses in the league. In 2020, they scored the 4th most points in the league. They had the 6th most net yards per attempt in the league. And Ryan Tannehill's production premium was number 2 among NFL quarterbacks. So that 32.3% means he was 32% better than an average NFL starting quarterback. So if you want to put a name to that, think he was 32% better than a guy like Derek Carr, for example, or a guy like, Kirk Cousins, who might even be a little bit better than that. But in 2019, that number was number 1 in the NFL. So over the last 2 years, this offense has been super efficient, and Ryan Tannehill has been super efficient. When you lose your offensive coordinator, you lose your number 2 target in Corey Davis, your number 3 target in Jonnu Smith, your number 4 target, Adam Humphries, your number 6 target in Khalif Raymond, and you're only replacing them with a raw 4th-round rookie in Des Fitzpatrick and Josh Reynolds. It doesn't inspire a whole lot of confidence in Tannehill for me. And again, he's not a sell candidate necessarily, but he's a guy that I definitely have a little buyer's remorse on, and one that is probably worth shopping if you can get top 12 quarterback value for. And like I said, I took this guy in the end of the 4th round. He was about the 12th quarterback off the board at that point. And I still feel a little bit hesitant on it, even though I have A.J. Brown and I have the stack between those two. It is a little sketchy for me. So Tannehill is a guy that I would probably just avoid in dynasty startups if you haven't already done one yet. I would just let somebody else take him and let somebody else deal with the headache. If you currently own him, like I said, shop him, see if you can get top 12 quarterback value for him. Maybe you can, even flip him for a younger guy and a little bit of an extra piece or something like that. I would totally flip Tannehill right now for Justin Fields, Trey Lance, or Trevor Lawrence if you can. Maybe you can even get a little bit more on top of that if the person that traded them to you is a contender and they're looking to win right away. So the last guy that we're going to get into on this list, we're going over to the wide receiver position. And this is another riser for me. It's Michael Pittman Jr., wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts, currently being picked off the board right now, wide receiver 40 83rd overall is currently a late 6th rounder. And I would say that's even a little high. I think he goes probably a bit later than that in most dynasty startup drafts. But nonetheless, Michael Pittman was a guy I was literally grabbing in every single draft last offseason. If you guys watched our content in redraft last year, I talked about grabbing this guy with my last pick every single draft, because the reason I said that was I made parallels to A.J. Brown in his rookie season, where there really wasn't any target competition in that offense. For Indianapolis, they had Paris Campbell, who was often injured, and they had T.Y. Hilton, who I didn't believe in at all and I thought was just completely washed up. Pittman didn't come out and light the world on fire, but this coaching staff and this front office believed in him so much, to the point that Frank Reich, after they drafted Michael Pittman, dubbed him the best receiver in the 2020 draft. A draft that included Justin Jefferson, that included CeeDee Lamb and Jerry Jeudy and all these guys, T. Higgins and Brandon Ayuk. All those guys went ahead of Pittman in the draft, but Frank Reich said that he was their number one ranked receiver, and they discussed his ability to win on the outside, to be a true X receiver, as a big part of their offense. And they drafted this guy at 34th overall, ahead of Jonathan Taylor. And I'm guessing they have very lofty expectations for this dude, which is probably why they added nobody to the receiving core, right? They could have went out and signed, Juju Smith-Schuster or Will Fuller or any of these free agents that signed one-year deals to multi-year extensions, but they never made an attempt to actually go out and be aggressive and attack the receiver position, which they would have done if they didn't believe in this guy as their number one. So again, another instance where they didn't add to the receiving core, they had Rashad Bateman on the board at 22 in this year's draft, and they didn't pick him. And I said, going into the draft, I thought the Colts were a great landing spot for a guy like Rashad Bateman. They just didn't pick the guy. And again, that tells me that Pittman's the dude. They think Pittman is the number one receiver of this offense. They have Michael Pittman as their X receiver. They have Paris Campbell, again, who's often injured, who's only played like 5 games in his career, and T.Y. Hilton, who is completely washed up and signed late in the process for a 1-year contract. Those are the guys directly behind Michael Pittman. And they honestly don't even have a tight end or, anyone to speak of in that respect. So honestly, Michael Pittman's biggest target competition from an established target in this offense is still T.Y. Hilton, who's completely washed up. And then even you could argue Nyheim Hines might be next in line after that. And neither of these other receivers have shown the ability to stay healthy or make a big impact when they've been on the field the past few years. When you take a look at how Pittman closed the season this past year, it was actually quite respectable. 6 of the last 9 games, he saw 5 targets or more in 6 of those games. You could see he had a game over 100 yards against the Tennessee Titans, which prompted Frank Reich to talk about him in glowing respects after that game, talked about how he's, really picking up the offense, kind of, he's getting things under control. And Carson Wentz, despite what people think about him, is a quarterback upgrade over, old man Phillip Rivers. Not only is Wentz reunited with Frank Reich, who last time we saw Carson Wentz with Frank Reich, we saw him play at an MVP level in 2017. He hasn't had a true X receiver, Carson Wentz, since Alshon Jeffrey in 2017 when he was last healthy. And Alshon Jeffrey finished as a solid wide receiver 2 in fantasy that year, with plenty of more target competition than what Michael Pittman has to deal with, right? In 2017, Alshon Jeffrey was competing with Zach Ertz, who was a top 3 tight end. He was competing with Nelson Aguilar, who was like a wide receiver 3 slot receiver type, and Torrey Smith, who was like a boomer bust, downfield option. So with what we have with Michael Pittman, we're looking at a guy who's probably going to fit into that Alshon Jeffrey mold and do it in a situation where if Alshon Jeffrey in 2017 was in this situation, he would have finished a lot higher than wide receiver 18 or whatever he finished in 2017. So Pittman is going to be one of my biggest breakout candidates that I'm targeting. He's going to be potentially the biggest winner of this entire offseason that absolutely nobody is talking about. I don't see anybody talking about this guy. They didn't add anybody to this receiving core. You got a quarterback upgrade. It's totally wheels up for Michael Pittman Jr. I expect a big, big year from him. So if you guys enjoyed this video, if you guys feel like you got some value from it, go ahead down below, hit the like button, comment any of your thoughts down below, subscribe to the channel if you are new, join the Discord, totally free to do. It's completely popping in there all the time, talking football. And like I said, tune in to later today when we're going to be announcing a big, big time announcement for our upcoming summer schedule, our upcoming draft guide launching in July. So make sure you guys are stay tuned to that. Peace out and enjoy your Wednesday.
Wire me the money.